name is James Snapp Jr., and today I'm reviewing the 4th episode of the television series Bible Secrets Revealed. This episode was called The Real Jesus. It did not discuss the Annunciation, nor did it mention the account of Mary's visit to her relative, Elizabeth. Its first subject was the birth of Jesus, and almost as soon as the narrator mentioned the biblical accounts of Jesus' birth, the narrator questioned their accuracy. He also questioned the calculation of the year in which Jesus was born. Nothing about the accuracy of the Bible stands or falls on that calculation, but it should be pointed out that the narrator's claim that recent historical research has shown that Jesus was not born in AD 1 was incorrect. The 1600s are not recent. Viewers who saw the first episode of Bible Secrets Revealed might expect the treatment that Dr. Bart Ehrman and Dr. Reza Aslan gave to the birth narratives in this episode. They dismissed them as fiction that was created to make readers think that Jesus fulfilled the prophecy of Micah chapter 5, verse 2. That's a clever approach, because when the Gospels say that Jesus fulfills the prophecy, it's interpreted as evidence that the authors must have made up the story. But if Jesus had not fulfilled the prophecy, the objection could be raised that Jesus therefore can't be the Messiah. Let's explore a couple of questions about the accounts of the birth of Jesus. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, Luke states that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census should be taken of the whole Roman world. That does not mean that everyone in the empire was registered at the same time. The officials in charge of each province were left to their own devices about how to conduct the census. Now, Luke connects the census with the Roman governor Quirinius. The main difficulty with that is that Quirinius was the governor of Syria after the death of Herod. Interpreters have offered several explanations of Luke's statement. One is that Luke meant that Quirinius was governing in some capacity other than governor. Another theory is that the local census began in the days of Herod, but when Herod died, the project was delayed, and it was not resumed until years later when Quirinius was governor. Another theory is that Luke uses unusual Greek in chapter 2, verse 2. Instead of meaning this census first took place under Quirinius, he meant that this census took place prior to that of Quirinius. The census that occurred in AD 6 under Quirinius was famous because it accompanied the introduction of direct Roman rule. Luke anticipated that his readers might assume that he was referring to that census, and so he added this note to clarify that he was referring to a less well-known census that had occurred earlier. We can't read Luke's mind and prove exactly what he was thinking, but these possibilities answer the objection that there can't have been any such census. Another question to consider is, if Joseph resided in Nazareth, why would he travel to Bethlehem? One possible reason is that Joseph was poor and frequently moved from place to place wherever he could find work, and for tax purposes, Bethlehem rather than Nazareth was the closest thing he had to a permanent home. Another is that after Mary told Joseph about Gabriel's message, Joseph believed her and perceived that the proper thing to do would be to move to Bethlehem so that Micah's prophecy would be fulfilled. The program then discussed the virgin birth. The narrator said, "The references to Jesus being born of a virgin can only be found in 2 of the Gospels, Matthew and Luke. Wouldn't such a miraculous event have been more widely reported?" The answer is no. Mark didn't mention it because Peter was his main source of information about Jesus. John probably didn't mention it because he wanted to supplement existing reports about Jesus, not to repeat what they already said. When Robert Cargill attempted to dismiss the account of the virgin conception as if it was composed to make Jesus fulfill the prophecy in Isaiah 7:14, he described that prophecy as if it occurred during the time of Hezekiah. Hezekiah was alive when Isaiah delivered that prophecy, but he was a child. That prophecy was given to his father, King Ahaz. It looks like Dr. Cargill was a little mixed up. To see my response to his theory, watch my review of the first episode of Bible Secrets Revealed. Instead of repeating what I said previously, I will move on to the next part of the program, which focused on a composition known as the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. The narrator scriptwriter said that this text is believed to have been written around 125 AD. Then he referred to it as a first-hand account of the boy Jesus' life. Those two things don't fit together. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas is not an eyewitness account. About the most significant thing about it is that it says that Jesus made clay birds and then made them fly. This story circulated widely and is found in the Quran. When the program wandered back from the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the subject changed to John the Baptist. And in this segment, the narrator and the consultants made a series of mistakes. After Robert Cargill claimed that Jesus and John were rivals, Reza Aslan claimed many of John's disciples thought of their master as superior to Jesus. After all, as they argued, who baptized whom? Where did he get this? In the Gospels, John plainly tells people that he's not the Messiah. Who participated in this argument to which Dr. Aslan referred? It looks like Dr. Aslan was just making stuff up. The narrator scriptwriter, not to be outdone, also made stuff up. He said, the Romans had John the Baptist arrested, sent to prison, and eventually beheaded. No, that's not what the Gospels say. They say that Herod did that. The first century historian Josephus also says that it was Herod who had John killed. Next, a professor named Chris Keith claimed that the beheading of John the Baptist provided the inauguration of Jesus' kind of solo ministry. No, it did not. During John's imprisonment, Jesus was preaching and teaching and recruiting disciples. By the time John was executed, Jesus' own ministry was already well underway. Now, viewers might easily conclude that some of the consultants were engaged in a contest about who could teach the most made-up stuff about John the Baptist. Then a new subject was introduced, Jesus' miracles. Kathleen McGowan began this part by correctly stating that at the wedding in Cana, Jesus turned water into the best wine. Regarding Jesus' miracles, the narrator asked, were they real? Or were they concocted by his followers? You'd think this is a pretty important question, but the subject flew by in 1 minute and 15 seconds, and suddenly there was a new topic, a parable that Jesus told in Matthew chapter 20. The narrator said that in this passage, Jesus taught the concept of equal pay per day, regardless of hours worked. The parable of the workers in the vineyard was not intended to promote some socialistic notion of equal pay for unequal work. It's about God's vineyard, not about one belonging to human beings. God invites people into his kingdom when they are young, but he also invites people into his kingdom when they are old. He invites people who are trained from their youth. He also invites those who hear God's call late in the day. What Jesus was teaching is that salvation is not something that you earn. It's the result of God's grace. The narrator's next question was about how Jesus could afford to maintain his ministry. And part of the answer is just what Luke says. A group of women, including Mary Magdalene, financially supported his ministry. Luke names them: Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, and more. That's no secret. But this introduced a new subject, Mary Magdalene, and suddenly we have entered the Da Vinci zone. Kathleen McGowan claimed that the Gnostic texts contain many references to Jesus' relationship to Mary Magdalene. Even if that were true, she's referring to Gnostic propaganda, not to anything written by anyone who knew Jesus or the apostles or Mary Magdalene. What other ideas about Mary Magdalene does Kathleen McGowan promote? She's claimed to be guided by dreams to several revelations about Mary Magdalene. She has depicted the wedding in Cana as the wedding of John the Baptist and Mary Magdalene. She depicted John the Baptist beating Mary Magdalene. She depicted Mary Magdalene marrying Jesus after John the Baptist's death. And she depicted Mary Magdalene and Jesus starting a family that will eventually include someone someone with red hair, who will discover the real teachings of Jesus. But then her fellow consultant, Bart Ehrman, concisely deconstructed her claim that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married. Next, Dr. Jennifer Nust described how the belief that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute got started. Although she put Gregory I in the wrong century, she correctly observed that he was largely responsible for that false idea. Someone should tell Dr. Cargill, because in episode 1, he claimed that the Bible frequently refers to Mary Magdalene as a prostitute. Moving along. The program focused on an event recorded in Matthew chapter 16, where Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter answers, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." But the program did not show viewers what happened next. Instead, the scene in Matthew stopped, and an interview with Dale Martin, a homosexual professor at Yale, began. Neither Dr. Martin nor the narrator mentioned that after Simon Peter affirmed that Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus told him that what he said had been revealed to him by God. Now, Jesus could have replied, "No, I'm just another prophet," or, "That's crazy talk, Simon. I'm just a teacher who wants people to be nice to each other." His answer unmistakably affirms that Peter was right. During most of his ministry, Jesus did not want his followers to openly call him the Messiah, because to a lot of people, Messiah meant anti-Roman military general instead of the suffering servant who reconciles mankind to God. Nevertheless, Jesus did sometimes affirm that people who regarded him as the Messiah were correct. Besides the confession of Peter, there's the case of the blind beggar Bartimaeus. When he calls out to Jesus, applying to Jesus the Messianic title, Son of David, Jesus summons Bartimaeus and heals him. When the woman at the well says that the Messiah would sort out a theological controversy, Jesus says, "I who speak to you am he." And on Palm Sunday, when the crowd calls Jesus the Son of David, Jesus refuses to rebuke them. None of this was pointed out in this episode. Instead, viewers were given a series of statements from several consultants offering different answers to the question of whether Jesus' teachings were spiritual or social or political. Dr. James Tabor stated that Jesus was a revolutionary because he told the 12 apostles, "I have chosen you 12 because you will sit on 12 thrones ruling the 12 tribes of Israel." He was referring to Luke chapter 22, verses 29 through 30. Bart Ehrman emphasized this verse too. What does that statement mean? Especially considering that Jesus said it the evening before he was crucified. By the time Luke wrote his gospel account, at least one of the faithful apostles, James the son of Zebedee, had already been killed. The other apostles were scattered. So it's very likely that Luke intended for his readers to regard this declaration as a symbolic statement about the leadership of the church, or as something to be fulfilled after the second coming, rather than as a literal event that was supposed to happen right away. About 2/3 of the way through the program, the subject shifted to the events of Passion Week, beginning with Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, which fulfilled the prophecy of Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. Chris Keith said, "If Jesus ever did ride into Jerusalem on a donkey, he would have been self-consciously encouraging them to think of him in terms of the promised Davidic king." I agree. And that answers the narrator's question, did Jesus really think he was the Messiah? And I'd like to ask Dr. Keith, why are you saying if? Do you think the triumphal entry is fiction because it fulfilled prophecy? The next event covered by the program was the cleansing of the temple. Dr. Gary Burge offered a well-expressed evaluation of why Jesus drove out the money changers. 45 seconds later, the subject shifted to the Roman trial of Jesus, and we returned to the narrator's sensationalistic questions and to Reza Aslan's sensationalistic answers. The biggest problem with this segment was not that Dr. Aslan exaggerated Pontius Pilate's severity, and it wasn't that Dr. Keith took events out of focus instead of bringing them into focus. The biggest problem was that although the narration referred to the trial held by Pontius Pilate, and the graphics depicted the trial held by Pontius Pilate, The commentary offered by Dr. Moss seemed to be about Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin, the local council that was led by the high priest Caiaphas, a trial which the narrator did not mention at all. That's huge. What happened to the council trial, Kevin Burns? Was it abducted by aliens? Cue the narrator. After repeatedly raising the question, did Jesus really claim to be the Messiah? Why does this episode avoid mentioning a scene in which Jesus affirms that he is the Messiah? Was this omission, this censoring of the gospel accounts, the effect of a theological agenda? Now, the final segment of the show was about 5 minutes long, and at first, it looked like it was going to be about Jesus' resurrection. But instead of presenting any of the Gospel's accounts of the encounters between Jesus and his followers after he rose from the dead, this episode presented theories that denied Jesus' bodily resurrection from James Tabor, Bart Ehrman, and Dale Martin. James Tabor offered his theory that on the Sunday after Jesus died, the tomb in which Jesus' body had been placed was empty because the body had been taken away to be reburied. The Gospel of John says that Mary Magdalene thought that Jesus' body had been carried away, but then the risen Jesus appeared to her and spoke with her. Dr. Tabor's theory falls apart unless the text is treated like a cafeteria. He accepts John's statement that the tomb was near the place of crucifixion, then he rejects the Gospel statements about Jesus' bodily appearance. Dale Martin's comment seems particularly dismissive of the Gospel accounts. How did he interpret the statements in Luke 24 that the risen Jesus showed his disciples his hands and feet and ate a piece of fish while they watched? He said, maybe they saw a shadow on a wall. After the segment about Jesus' bodily resurrection, or to put it more accurately, the segment about liberal professors' disbelief in Jesus' bodily resurrection, you might think that the next part would focus on the Great Commission and the Ascension. But nothing was said about that. When the show ended, the narrator was still asking if Jesus was only a prophet. Does a prophet say, all power is given unto me in heaven and on earth? The Gospels clearly present Jesus as more than a prophet. The professors who spoke in this segment have rejected what the Bible says about Jesus. When they pick and choose which parts of the Gospels to believe, they're treating the text like a set of paints instead of like a set of portraits. So, to sum up my review, this episode contained a lot of misinformation. It neglected some major events in the life of Christ. Its main consultants made a lot of mistakes. If you want to learn about Jesus as he's imagined by those consultants, this is the program for that. If you want to learn about the real Jesus, I encourage you to read the Gospels, find a Bible-believing Christian church, and ask God to guide you to know the real Jesus Christ, God's Son, our Savior. Thank you for watching. The television program Bible Secrets Revealed, The Real Jesus, was broadcast on the History Channel. Copyright 2013 A&E Television Networks, LLC, all rights reserved, and was produced by Prometheus Entertainment. Its contents were cited as part of a review.